On a warm morning in 1906, San Francisco's streets bustled with horses, wagons, and the chatter of vendors. Nobody knew that beneath their boots the earth was wound tight like a spring, ready to snap. At 5:12 a.m., the city exhaled a roar, louder than thunder. Pavement split, buildings swayed. In an instant, lives, fortunes, and dreams collapsed with the shaking ground. This was the day the earth buckled. Subscribe now, because this is not just history, it's a story of survival, injustice, and the raw fight for human dignity. The day before the quake was almost too perfect to notice. Fog clung to the edges of San Francisco Bay like a shawl, retreating slowly as the sun climbed. On Market Street, the clatter of streetcars mixed with the smell of fresh bread from corner bakeries. Children chased each other across cobblestones, dodging delivery wagons pulled by tired horses. The city was alive, arrogant even, proud of its banks, its theatres, its mansions built on Nob Hill that overlooked everything below. At the O'Reilly boarding house on Mission Street, Maggie O'Reilly pushed open the shutters to let the air in. She was 23, a seamstress, her fingers always scarred with needle pricks. Rent was due at the end of the week, and her pay from stitching gowns barely kept her afloat. Still she hummed while she pinned up her dark hair, because San Francisco, for all its cruelty, promised opportunity. At least that's what everyone told themselves. Her neighbor, Mr. Chen, a grocer, loaded his cart with sacks of rice and oranges. He had come from Guangdong 10 years earlier, only to find himself fenced into Chinatown by prejudice and laws that told him he didn't belong. Yet he worked every day because his wife and little daughter depended on him. That morning, his daughter Mei Ling clutched his sleeve, begging him not to leave so early. He smiled, kissed the top of her head, and promised he'd be back by nightfall. On the other side of the city, banker Henry Whitman strolled into his office. He was already thinking of expansion, of buying up land to build another marble-faced building. The city was swelling, money flowing in like tidewater. He didn't notice the slight tremors that had been rattling cups at night, or perhaps he chose not to notice. Men like him always believed the world was theirs to command. At 5 a.m., most of San Francisco still slept. Dogs stirred uneasily, their ears twitching at something deep beneath the ground. Horses pawed nervously in their stalls. No one heard the faint groan beneath the surface, like steel being twisted in a giant's hands. Maggie, half awake, thought she felt her bed tremble, but blamed it on a passing wagon. Mei Ling dreamed of running through a field of lanterns. Henry Whitman leaned back in his leather chair, calculating interest rates by lamplight. Then at 5:12, the city's heartbeat stopped. A roar erupted, a sound not of this world, deeper than thunder, sharper than cannon fire. The floor buckled, splitting wood and stone alike. Maggie was thrown to the ground as her wardrobe toppled over her. Mr. Chen watched his shelves collapse in a shower of glass jars and rice spilling like sand. Horses bolted, screams tore through the dawn, and buildings swayed like drunkards. The quake lasted less than a minute, but to those inside it felt endless. Streets ripped apart, gas mains snapped, chimneys toppled. In that instant, San Francisco, proud, arrogant, alive, fell to its knees, and that was only the beginning. When the shaking stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. For a breathless moment, San Francisco stood still, broken beams balanced on the edge of collapse, dust hanging in the air like fog, people stunned into immobility. Then came the cries, high-pitched wails of children, the ragged shouts of men digging with bare hands, the shrieks of women trapped beneath stone. Maggie clawed her way out from under her wardrobe, coughing, her arms bleeding from splinters. She ran into the street barefoot, joining the swarm of neighbors staggering out of shattered homes. The sky had barely begun to brighten, yet already it was clouded with dust and smoke. She saw Mr. Chen carrying Mei Ling, her small face streaked with blood from a falling tile. His wife limped beside them, clutching at her ribs. They locked eyes with Maggie, no words, just the terrible knowledge that they were all caught in the same nightmare. But worse than the wreckage was the smell. Gas lines had ruptured across the city. The stench of leaking fuel mingled with the acrid smoke of wood already burning. The quake had knocked over stoves, toppled lamps. Soon, orange tongues of fire licked upward from houses and shops, hungry, unstoppable. On Market Street, Henry Whitman stumbled into the open, his expensive coat covered in white plaster. His bank stood cracked but still upright. Relief surged through him until he saw flames racing down the block. In seconds, he realized what this meant. Wood buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder, winds from the bay feeding the inferno. Fire would consume more than the quake ever could. By sunrise, San Francisco wasn't just broken, it was burning. The soldiers arrived first. The army garrison at the Presidio marched down with rifles and bayonets gleaming. General Funston gave his orders quickly, dynamite whole blocks to stop the fire's advance. If houses had to be sacrificed, so be it. Owners screamed, begging soldiers not to destroy what little remained. "Blow it!" the sergeants barked, and explosions followed, flattening homes that the quake had spared. But the blasts only spread sparks farther, igniting more roofs. Chaos bred cruelty. Maggie saw a man shot in the street, accused of looting bread from a bakery. Mr. Chen tried to shield his family as soldiers forced Chinatown residents into lines, treating them not as survivors, but as suspects. "Back! Back!" the soldiers shouted, bayonets flashing, as if fire and falling walls were not punishment enough. By noon, the city was a battlefield between man and fire. Smoke blotted out the sun. People ran carrying what they could, mattresses, pots, cages with parrots squawking inside. Some carried nothing at all, just their children, their faces set with grim determination. The sound of explosions echoed between collapsing buildings. Maggie found herself gripping Mei Ling's hand, pulling her toward the waterfront. "Stay close," she yelled, her voice drowned by the roar of flames and dynamite. Behind them, whole neighborhoods were vanishing into walls of fire. Henry Whitman, desperate to save his vault, bribed soldiers to guard his bank. Gold and contracts could not burn, he thought. But no bribe could change the wind or halt the tide of fire. The day the earth buckled was only the first blow. Now came the firestorm, merciless, indiscriminate, and alive. By the second night, the city no longer looked like San Francisco. Whole districts had been erased, replaced by smoldering plains of brick and twisted iron. The glow of fire painted the sky crimson, visible even from ships far out in the bay. For those trapped inside, the air was unbreathable, smoke thick enough to sting eyes and choke lungs. Maggie staggered with Mei Ling through streets that once bustled with carriages and laughter. Now they were avenues of ghosts, people wandering in shock, their faces grey with ash, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some whispered prayers, others muttered nonsense. Everyone's eyes carried the same dazed question. Where do we go now? Near Portsmouth Square, soldiers had erected barricades. They shouted orders, sometimes firing warning shots into the air. Anyone caught taking food or water without permission was branded a looter. Maggie watched as a boy, no older than 12, was dragged by his collar, accused of stealing apples from a toppled cart. His cries for his mother were drowned out by jeers and rifle butts. The crowd looked away, too afraid to interfere. Mr. Chen tried to keep his family close, but Chinatown had been targeted for controlled burns. Soldiers claimed dynamite was needed to stop the fire from spreading, but they aimed it at Chinese shops and homes first. Entire blocks exploded, families screaming as their last belongings went up in flames. Chen's wife whispered, "They want us gone." He knew she was right. The disaster had become an excuse to erase people like them. Meanwhile, Henry Whitman clung to his illusion of control. He stood outside his cracked bank, ordering clerks to salvage ledgers and seal vaults. But fire crept closer each hour. When soldiers demanded he evacuate, he waved papers in their faces. "Do you know who I am? This city runs on my credit." But the flames didn't care about credit or marble facades. By dawn, his bank was engulfed, his fortune reduced to smoke curling into the sky. The fire drove survivors toward the waterfront. Thousands gathered at the piers, sleeping on planks, drinking from barrels of water that smelled of salt and oil. Maggie sat with Mei Ling curled against her shoulder, both trembling from exhaustion. Mr. Chen passed her a small orange he had salvaged. Hardly food for three, but he insisted she take it. Maggie broke it into slices, giving one to Mei Ling, one to Chen's daughter, and only then dared taste the last piece herself. Above them, the city roared and cracked, as if it were alive and dying at once. "Will it stop?" Mei Ling asked, in a hoarse whisper. Maggie pulled her closer. "It has to," she said. But in her heart, she wasn't sure. Behind them, San Francisco, the proud city of gold and opportunity, was turning into a memory made of ash. By the third day, San Francisco was a city without homes. The firestorm had devoured nearly 500 blocks, leaving only blackened chimneys standing like tombstones. Survivors poured into parks, hillsides, and the open spaces of the Presidio, where canvas tents sprang up overnight. Golden Gate Park became a sea of refugees, mothers cradling infants, old men lying on blankets, children wandering without shoes or parents. Maggie and the Chens found themselves in a camp near Jefferson Square. Soldiers had staked out a perimeter, handing out rations of bread and canned beans, never enough for the swelling crowd. People lined up for hours, only to be told supplies were gone. The lucky ate, the unlucky went hungry. At night, the camps filled with a strange chorus, the muffled sobs of those who had lost everything, the moans of the injured, the restless murmurs of thousands trying to make sense of a world turned upside down. Maggie clutched Mei Ling close under a blanket stitched from scraps, her own stomach hollow. She wondered what her sewing skills were worth now, when fabric itself was ash. In another camp, Henry Whitman sat apart from the ragged masses. He had managed to bribe a soldier to fetch him fresh bread and whiskey, flaunting the little wealth he carried in gold coins sewn into his coat lining. Yet even there, he was not immune to ruin. His bank was gone, his records destroyed. The fortune he once commanded existed only in his mind. Men he'd once lent money to passed him in the dirt and spat at his boots. For the first time, Henry felt what it meant to be powerless. For Mr. Chen, the insult went deeper. When he brought his family to register for food, the clerk waved him aside. "Chinese get theirs later," the man said flatly. Hours later, the supplies were gone. Chen's wife fainted from hunger. He begged for help, only to be shoved back by a bayonet. "Not your turn," a soldier barked. The disaster had not erased prejudice, it had sharpened it. Yet even in misery, sparks of humanity glowed. Maggie, seeing Chen's desperation, slipped him half of her ration. She said nothing, just pressed the food into his palm. Tears filled his eyes, but he bowed his head in silent gratitude. Nearby, children formed little games with sticks and stones, their laughter startling in a place otherwise filled with despair. As days passed, rumors spread like wildfire. Disease in the camps, vigilantes patrolling the ruins, government promises of aid that never came. People whispered that the city would never rise again, that San Francisco had been cursed. One evening, As the sun bled into the smoky horizon, Maggie watched Mei Ling chase fireflies among the tents. For the first time in days, the girl laughed. And in that fragile sound, Maggie felt something shift. The city had buckled, but maybe, just maybe, the people inside it could still stand. By the end of the first week, the smoke began to clear. What remained of San Francisco looked like the bones of a burned giant, skeletal walls, iron twisted into grotesque shapes, streets paved with rubble. From Telegraph Hill one could see the full ruin, the proud city flattened, scarred black, as if the earth had swallowed it whole. The refugee camps became small towns of their own, tents lined up in ragged rows, cook fires sending thin smoke into the air, people trading scraps of food or labor for survival. Yet hope was rationed thinner than bread. Disease stalked the camps, and tempers flared in lines that never seemed to move. Maggie kept sewing, even in the ashes. She salvaged torn fabric from blankets and skirts, stitching them together for children who shivered at night. It wasn't much, but it gave her purpose, a way to hold on to dignity. Mei Ling clung to her side, sometimes calling her sister, in a whisper that made Maggie's chest ache. Mr. Chen searched for work, but few would hire a Chinese man in those days, disaster or not. When he offered to help rebuild homes, one foreman sneered, "We'll hire real Americans first." Still, Chen persisted, hauling bricks until his hands bled, just to earn a few coins for rice. His quiet endurance was a rebellion no fire could consume. Meanwhile, Henry Whitman tried to resurrect his empire from the dust. He traveled to the temporary city hall demanding loans and government support, but without his ledgers, his claims to wealth meant little. Officials shrugged him off. In the refugee camps, people whispered that men like Whitman had hoarded wealth while the poor burned. For the first time, he felt the cold edge of contempt directed at him. Despite injustice, some found ways to lift others. Volunteers set up soup kitchens. Nurses treated the wounded with almost no supplies. Sailors from ships anchored in the bay ferried water ashore in barrels, saving thousands from thirst. Out of catastrophe, small acts of decency became lifelines. But with every promise of aid, there came betrayal. The city announced plans to rebuild, gleaming boulevards, stronger buildings, a new San Francisco. But rumors spread that Chinatown would not be rebuilt at all. Powerful men saw profit in its ashes, scheming to drive families like the Chens out forever. One night, around the campfire, Maggie listened as Chen spoke softly, his voice low with exhaustion. "They think this fire erased us," he said, looking into the flames. "But we are still here, and we will build again, even if they don't want us to." Maggie met his gaze and nodded. "Then we'll build together." Around them, the city groaned in pain, but under the ash, something stubborn, something human, was beginning to rise. By summer, the first outlines of a new San Francisco began to emerge. Wooden scaffolds rose where proud stone buildings once stood. The air smelled of sawdust and sweat instead of smoke. But beneath the sound of hammers and shouts, another battle rumbled, a fight over who had the right to belong in the city reborn. Developers and politicians stood before the ruins with gleaming eyes. A chance to start fresh, they said. To them, the quake was not tragedy, but opportunity. To redraw streets, erase undesirable districts, and tighten their grip on land. Chinatown was their first target. Plans circulated in hushed meetings, turn the ashes into prime real estate, scatter its people to the winds. Mr. Chen learned of these schemes from whispers among laborers. When he tried to protest, city officials laughed in his face. "You'll go where we tell you," one said. "This is no place for shacks and laundry shops anymore." Rage burned in Chen's chest, hotter than the fire that had leveled his home. He knew what they meant, erasure. In the refugee camp, Maggie stitched banners for protests. She had never seen herself as political, but after nights of watching Mei Ling shiver under torn blankets, she couldn't stay silent. "If they can erase one neighborhood," she told survivors gathered around the fire, "they can erase us all." Her words lit sparks in the crowd. Henry Whitman, meanwhile, tried to insert himself back into power. He sat in city meetings insisting that banks like his must be rebuilt first for the economy to recover. But his arrogance fell flat. He had no building, no records, no leverage. His voice, once obeyed, now grated on ears that had grown tired of his kind. For the first time, Henry felt irrelevant in the very city he thought he owned. The protests grew louder. Chinese families marched through the rubble carrying lanterns, a silent reminder of their presence. Irish workers, black labourers, widows and orphans joined them, demanding fair treatment, food and housing. Maggie stitched slogans onto scraps of canvas. "We lived through the fire, we will live here still." The authorities answered with soldiers. Bayonets glinted once again on the streets, as if survival were a crime. Maggie stood trembling as soldiers shoved her aside during a march, her sewing kit spilling needles into the dust. But Mei Ling ran forward, picking up the cloth banner and raising it high above her head. The child's defiance froze the crowd, and then ignited cheers. For a moment, the power shifted, if only in spirit. The city could be rebuilt in marble and glass, but the true foundation lay in its people, their stubborn refusal to vanish. By autumn, the fight for San Francisco's soul reached its boiling point. The ashes had cooled, scaffolds multiplied, and politicians declared the city open for business. But to survivors, promises sounded hollow. New boulevards gleamed while refugee camps still overflowed. The powerful rebuilt banks and hotels first, while families slept under canvas. The greatest tension centered on Chinatown. Developers insisted the district be erased, its land too valuable for foreign hovels. They called it progress. To Chen, it was theft. He gathered his neighbors in the shell of their ruined temple, lanterns hanging where a roof had once been. "If we let them scatter us now," he said, "we will never return. We must fight, not with fists, but with our voices." Maggie was there, sewing a banner in the flickering light. Her hands shook, not from fear, but determination. "Then let's give them a parade they'll never forget." And so, on a crisp October morning, thousands poured into the streets. Chinese families carried red silk lanterns. Irish labourers raised shovels like standards. Widows held photos of lost husbands. Children walked barefoot, clutching scraps of cloth Maggie had stitched into flags. Even Henry Whitman appeared, humbled now, joining not as a leader, but as a man stripped of privilege, walking silently beside those he once ignored. The march surged toward City Hall, where officials stood waiting, soldiers lined up with rifles. Tension crackled in the air. A colonel barked for the crowd to disperse. No one moved. Then Mei Ling, tiny against the sea of bodies, stepped forward holding a banner twice her size. In crooked stitches it read, "We will not burn twice." Silence fell. Even the soldiers hesitated. The child's voice, small but fierce, carried through the square. "We are San Francisco too!" The crowd erupted, not with violence, but with a roar of voices, a wave of humanity refusing to be erased. Soldiers lowered their rifles. Some even joined in. Officials paled, realizing the city they thought they could control had already slipped from their grasp. In that moment, the battle was not won by gold or marble, but by memory, by the refusal to let the fire decide who belonged. Maggie looked at Mei Ling, her chest swelling with pride. Chen's eyes glistened, his arm wrapped around his wife. Even Henry bowed his head, humbled by a truth no fortune could buy. San Francisco would rise again, yes. But it would not belong only to the powerful. Its soul had been claimed by those who had nothing left but each other. Winter rains washed the last ash from San Francisco's streets, but the scars remained. Chimneys jutted from empty lots, black lines cut across cracked stone, and the air still smelled faintly of smoke. Yet out of ruin, life pulsed again. Markets reopened, streetcars clanged, children laughed in parks once filled with tents. Maggie returned to sewing, not gowns for wealthy ladies, but coats and blankets for neighbors. She no longer stitched to survive, she stitched to keep others warm. In every seam she left a quiet defiance, proof that hands which once trembled in fear could also build comfort. Mr. Chen rebuilt his shop, brick by brick, in the heart of Chinatown. Against every scheme to erase his community, he placed his store sign high, painted in bold red letters. "They thought the fire would scatter us," he told Maggie one evening, as lanterns lit the narrow street. "But fire can't burn away roots. We grow again." Mei Ling skipped between them, her laughter echoing like a bell. And Henry Whitman? He was no longer the banker who strutted in marble halls. His vaults were gone, his ledgers dust. Yet, in a strange way, he had gained more than he'd lost. He volunteered at soup kitchens, hammered nails in refugee shelters, listened instead of commanding. For the first time in his life, he was simply a man among others, bound by the same fragile thread of survival. The city rose, not as it had been, but as it must be, stitched from ashes, sweat, and the stubborn dignity of those who refused to vanish. San Francisco did not crumble because of fire or quake. It was rebuilt by ordinary people who discovered that when the earth buckled, it did not break them. Disaster strips away illusions. Gold, marble, power, all turn to ash. What endures is the courage to stand together, the memory of those who refused erasure, and the quiet strength of human dignity. If this story moved you, subscribe now, because history is not just dates and ruins, it's people who stood when everything else fell, and their fight for dignity is the story we still live today.